welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jessica, and with me I have...
Hello, I'm Jen.
And we have a really great author and I guess cartoonist here today. And her book, I'm So Happy You're Here, is delightful. So please tell everyone who you are and about the inspiration for writing this book.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. My name is Liz Climo. I am an author, an illustrator, comic artist. I worked in animation for a long time on The Simpsons for like 14 years, and then started posting my comics to a website or Tumblr, a Tumblr blog, and they sort of took off. And so now I do that full time and have been working in publishing for almost 10 years. And my latest book, I'm So Happy You're Here, just came out yesterday, Tuesday, and it is a sort of an adult picture book, but it's really all ages. I think I heard someone say 5 to 95, which is very accurate because it's just sort of a feel-good book that's meant to be sort of a companion. It's meant to cheer you up and just remind you that the people who love you are happy you're here, and just to feel good about yourself for exactly who you are.
I have some real feels about this book because it is very sweet. And like one of the things that kind of came to mind, when you say it's from 5 to 95, I have 7-year-olds. So if nobody is familiar with what a stuffy is, it's like what they call stuffed animals. My 7-year-olds, and I've heard other kids are using this term too. We just call them stuffed animals. But like my thought was while reading it, it's like affirmations from your childhood stuffies or your favorite picture book characters, just sort of, telling you it's okay, you're good, you're great. And it was just a very heartwarming experience.
That I love that. That's I have a 9-year-old and I'm familiar with the term stuffies as well. And that's right. I think I think as we get older, and certainly children too, like we have sort of like this internal dialogue, and I think it's important to sort of just try to practice speaking kindly to yourself. And I think it's easy for us to sort of speak negatively to ourselves, or just tell ourselves like we can't do it, or you should be afraid of this, or you shouldn't do this. And that's normal. It's all normal. And it's just the book is just sort of like reflecting on the practice of speaking a little bit more kindly to yourself, and yeah, just like a stuffy, being a companion, and letting the reader know that it's okay. Like it's okay if you're going through a hard time. And also I want to point out, it's not necessarily like you're having a hard time, well, cheer up. That's not what the message is supposed to be. It's more just like this it's normal to go through it, but the people, again, like the people in your life, and including yourself, are happy that you're here. So
I really loved its messaging. I thought it was really, sweet, as Jessica said, but also very, affirmative and very comforting. And, it struck me that it's kind of like, almost without saying it, like a teeny tiny intro guide to like some aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy, because it's about like the voice inside your head and your relationship to that voice, and what I really appreciated is that like it doesn't really like demonize that little voice, that we all have that tells us negative things sometimes, but it normalizes it, it like renders it a little bit less scary, not by like, casting it as a monster, but rather as like just part of your, I don't know, healthy ecosystem, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And that's a really lovely way to put it. And obviously I'm not a therapist, but I have gone to therapy, and I'm a very anxious person. I have generalized anxiety. So I am very familiar with the idea of like, the negative self-talk. And I've done a lot of practice to try and work on that. And you're right, because that voice is just another part of ourselves. So you have to, just trying to push it away and like demonize it, as you put it, it's not necessarily helpful. It's good it's embracing every part of yourself. So that's a really lovely thing to say, so thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm curious, just when you're drawing, the animals that you draw are adorable. They're adorable. But like, how do you, I mean, do you know what animal is going to be doing what or saying what? Like, like you have fish, you have a porcupine, like, is it the porcupine jumping on the pogo stick?
Oh yeah, that's
yeah.
a lemon. So yeah, that's a great question. And in that specific example, it's there's a line of little critters, and then there's one who's sort of like going against the grain, and those drawings are of lemmings, and so I kind of I chose that animal in particular because I wanted to represent everyone sort of going in the same direction, and this one wanting to go in another direction, and I think that's in that case it seemed like an appropriate animal to do that. And I mean the characters on a whole are sort of like, they're not so distinct. Like I can sort of swap them out, and like some days it's just like I just feel like drawing an alligator, so I'll draw an alligator. But I do try and make a point. Like for instance, I did a comic on Monday where the bear character, who I use a lot because he sort of just represents me, is holding something behind its back and saying, like, talking to a rat, and it's saying like, do you want to see something cute? And the rat says sure, and then it holds up a mirror in front of the rat's face, and the rat perks up. So in that situation, I was actually thinking of drawing maybe like a hamster or something else small, but then I was like, no, I think it needs to be an animal that maybe doesn't, it's sort of like people don't love, like people don't love rats. So it's sort of more like, hey, you know what? Like this is you, and like, isn't it cute? You are cute. And that rat is actually in the book, and it's like, it just felt like a nice sort of tie-in. But the answer is yes, I do try to think about, what animal I'm using to sort of represent whatever emotion I'm trying to get across.
I love that. I think that's really interesting, and I hadn't really thought about that much. I have another question about kind of how you like shaped this book, and maybe like how your approach to cartooning. I thought it was really interesting that you had worked both in animation and in putting work on Tumblr, which was a very vibrant space for webcomics at one point in history, or recent history. And I'm wondering, like, if either of these mediums or media influence the way that you approach writing a book as opposed to working on animation or a serial comic.
Well, I think my background in animation, and specifically The Simpsons, which is it's a sitcom, it's an animated sitcom, so like the acting, when I worked there, I did what's called character layout, and which is essentially just acting. So I would act out the characters, I would get direction from the director, and I would get the script from the writer, and I would sort of try to find the best way to convey the joke or convey the line by subtle acting, because it is, again, like a sitcom and not like a zany crazy cartoon. It's not like Wile E. Coyote. And so that, I think when I transitioned into comics, I was really like in this space where like humor was a very subtle thing, and so I think that lent itself to the sort of style of comedy that I'm doing, even though it's more gentle and like much more subtle than The Simpsons. But that background, I think, definitely kind of gave me the tools to sort of like make those jokes work. And also clarity is really important in animation, and in this doing character layout. You want to make everything really clear, nice silhouettes. You don't want the joke to get lost in a bunch of overcomplication. And so those really gave me the tools, I think, to sort of go to this space and like do something of my own, but like with the tools that I learned sort of working in animation. And then Tumblr, I didn't actually really know I didn't know how to make a website. I barely know how to make a website now. And so I was just kind of posting as a sort of a practice of accountability. While I was working on The Simpsons, I was like, well, I want to do my own stuff, and I want to put it out there so that like I have to keep doing it, sort of, in a way. And Tumblr was just like a really useful tool for me to just kind of like throw it up there, and it was just up, and I didn't have to do any programming or anything like that.
So when did you start drawing this and putting it together as a book? Did it sort of come to you as, okay, I'm going to make this like a complete project, or did you kind of start drawing these animals and you're like, I think that there is a reason I'm drawing them all and I want to put them together in a book?
So I started doing the actual, like the comics that appear in the book, or the characters that appear in the book. They sort of appeared first on my blog, and that was almost 10 years ago that I started putting them up there. And they were just comics. It was really just, here's an idea for a comic, usually a 2-panel comic. Here's the joke. And then it was sort of like self-contained, and then I'd move on and then, do more and more. And then with this book, I had done other picture books, and I had done, I have comic compilations that I've done where it's just a collection of those comics that I've posted to Tumblr. But with this one, I knew I wanted to do sort of a longer form book and story with those animals that are in the comics. And I had already done, I did a book called Your Mom and a book called Your Dad. And those books were similar, and like the animals all appeared in those books, and the narrator sort of takes you through and like talks about, comments on what's happening in the illustrations, and then ties together at the end. And so I had sort of done that already with those 2 books, but with this one, I really wanted to get away from, the roles of like a parent, or, I wanted to kind of focus more on the individual, because while those books were really fun and I'm very proud of them, I kind of wanted to talk more to, get away from that, because, some people aren't parents, and some people aren't filling a parental role in anyone's life. And let's talk about those people, what like, so yeah, I wanted to sort of just kind of do the same thing, but, in a kind of a broader scale.
So what are some of your favorite, I guess, feel good, either just like animation or maybe picture books that might be either geared toward children or adult? Like what is something that you would go to for like a feel good art experience?
So animation wise, there's a show called, I don't know if you've heard of a show called Gumball, but it's a show that my daughter's a big fan of, and I would sort of like, listen in as she was watching. I love that show so much. I think because it's really it's sort of, it is subtle in the way that it's really heartwarming. Like there's a few songs on that show that sort of celebrate differences, and like, like loving yourself. Like there's a character who's essentially, I think her name's Sussy, and it's just like an upside down face, and so it's like your chin and your mouth, and that's her character, and she's quote unquote weird and different, and so, but she's really confident and proud of herself. And so I love that show is like, so you think it's just kind of be like wacky zany and not have a lot underneath, but it is so it kind of like secretly gets you. I love that. I loved Over the Garden Wall, which was just stylistically beautiful.
Just introduced that one to my kids. We finished it 2 nights ago. And it was like, I was wondering what's the age that's the best to introduce it to them. And we weren't sure if it was going to be too scary, but perfection.
It's so good. And yeah, that's the thing. It's like, that's another one where it can kind of go a little into that scary direction, but it really is for all ages. And I mean, the voice actors, Melanie Linsky is like one of my favorites. And yeah, like who doesn't love Melanie Linsky? So it's like, yay. And I believe Christopher Lloyd does the voice too. So it's just, it's beautiful. I love that.
Tim Curry is in it too. It's not, yeah. Trying to remember if Tim Curry has 2 voices in it or one. I think John Cleese is in it. It's really Elijah Wood is in it. Actually, one of my friends, after it finished, she did this little like trivia thing, thinking she'd stump me. She's like, "What's the connection to Peter Jackson in this show?" I'm like, "Well, Melanie Linsky was in it wasn't Beautiful Creatures.
Was it not Beautiful?
Heavenly Creatures. Beautiful Creatures is that witch book based movie based on the book. Yes, Heavenly Creatures, and Elijah Wood was in Lord of the Rings, and she's like, I thought I stumped you. I'm like, you did not. It really is a very rich story that, for us adults, we see something in it, and I wasn't sure whether the kids were going to see something in it too, and it really is just great.
It's beautiful. And I think the thing I love about that, and I also love about Gumball, and the thing that they have in common, is I tend to sort of like something that's, there's like a dark comedy. Like I like a little bit of darkness in the art that I consume. And I'm also very aware that what I do is very, very sweet, and it's very feel good. And so I don't ever want to veer into a space where it's like too like saccharine or too maudlin. And I think it's nice to sort of like be inspired by these other comedies that like do the darkness really well. And hopefully I can like take tools from that and not go too over the top, like everything's okay. I don't ever want to be too much like that, but it's nice to sort of be uplifting when I can.
Yeah, I think another thing that I really appreciated about it, that it sort of shares with like some of these properties we've just been talking about, is that it has like a real sort of emotional core, like there is like a lot of kids entertainment is well, I'm thinking of like the 90s stuff that we watch, like the Nicktoons. A lot of it is like very influenced by like alternative comics, and that are themselves pretty dark or like pretty gross, and those like have a place, and those were great in their way. But I kind of appreciate this like recent turn into like sort of just like earnest stuff, like very sincere stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's also something The Simpsons has really done right, especially like the really early seasons. There was this moral compass that, and working on the show, like I remember there were certain things you just didn't really do. It's like within the script, I didn't really work with any of the writing at all, but like you would never get a script where there was like something that you would see like say on like Family Guy. It was always kind of like in a very like, again, like a moral compass and sort of like a code where they didn't really veer away from like that sort of like secretly wholesome center that was kind of buried underneath a bunch of antics and like kind of crass humor, which I liked.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Like, and that was like present from the very start too, because like, we often go back and watch old Simpsons as a sort of like another like security blanket type of type media. And when we watched Lisa Gets the Blues, like I was like crying the whole time. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is such an accurate depiction of just like of depressive thoughts and depressive feelings. And it really like that show has enormous sympathy for Lisa, and it takes her seriously and her feelings seriously. And like that was something that the show has always been really good at.
I agree. And Lisa's a great character because she's kind of the audience. Like she's kind of the most, realistic character in the whole show. So having her sort of go through that, I think it's just like a nice relatable way to sort of like, see like, hey, see that in yourself. Like I know how that feels, and and I know how, the outside sort of like reflects like what I'm feeling on the inside. So yeah, The Simpsons is great. It's a great show.
Yeah, Lisa's like, it's so funny with all of the characters. Lisa's like the meme of the century, with like the screen in the back holding her cue cards, and that I think she's kind of who I think of when it's like, listen, you don't like you were, you don't have to be overly sweet, and you don't have to be edgy for the sake of being edgy.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, people are always saying like The Simpsons predicted it, and like I don't, obviously that's not, The Simpsons aren't an oracle, like they're not actually predicting. It's like they're just we've had like the past few years have been so ridiculous, like so many things happen that like we just never really would have expected would happen, and The Simpsons was just sort of like parodying that way back when, and now here we are. And Lisa along the way was kind of like the voice of reason, like kind of like, no, this actually can't happen. It will happen. And then there we went. So
Oh, totally. Yeah, because I think like really what has happened is that like, The Simpsons didn't so much predict stuff as much as like just satire and reality have collapsed into each other. So it's kind of just indistinguishable from satire. I did have one more question about the book and its rhyme scheme and the writing of that, because it's really very well written. Like it scans perfectly. It's as a poet, like and I'm wondering, like, were there like what were the voices of children's books or children's writing that kind of like shaped your approach to the writing of this book?
Well, so it's interesting because when I wrote it, I feel like I wrote it out and I knew what I wanted to say, but I couldn't quite ever get it right. And then one day I just kind of started rhyming. And then it sort of like took it almost, as it sounds very silly and a little corny, but like it was almost like a path that unfolded in front of me where it was like with each rhyme, it sort of took me where I knew where I wanted to go because I'd already sort of written it out. But then the rhyme took me in a like sort of gave me more of a clear direction. And I think, you know, the obvious answers, like Shel Silverstein. I was always a huge fan of Shel Silverstein when I was young, still am. And I loved the sort of, the books of poetry where each page or each, every couple pages there was its own self-contained story, and so that certainly lent itself. And then also Dr. Seuss. Like I was, it has sort of a what's it? Other places you'll go, I suppose. Does that book rhymes, right? Okay, so it's that's those definitely, because that's what I was reading when I was young, and that and The Far Side, and so I feel like those all kind of combined and took me back. And the nice thing is that I hadn't the book before this one, Your Love, which is a children's book. That was the first time I'd ever rhymed in a book, and I wasn't actually sure I was allowed to. Like I wasn't sure when I sold the book and I told them what it was about. I didn't tell the publisher like, and it's gonna rhyme. So when I delivered the materials, I was a little like, I hope this is okay. And to be honest, they were like, sometimes rhyming doesn't work, and sometimes we're not thrilled, but this actually, this is working for us. And so it sort of took me on a path where now I love to do it. Like I think it's really fun. So.
I want to ask you about the color palette you use. It is very soothing, and it's like, but it's not like pastel, or it's very like earthy, and it feels very grounded. If that is, if that makes any sense, could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, color is something that I struggle with, and I am learning. I mean, I've come a long way, I think, and I'm still learning as I go, because color is, it's its own art form. And it's something that like I wasn't really super familiar with. And so I feel like when I started doing comics, I was, I work in Photoshop, so I would there was like a standard palette at the bottom, and I'd be like, green. I pick that color, blue. And then I started to become a little bit more thoughtful about it, and I would like pull color from, places where I'm like, oh, I like, I'd see a pictures and I'd be like, oh, I love that color. And I kind of pull that green and like put it in the gecko or something. And I've sort of just been doing that over the past 10 years. And then I'll take it and I'll, go into the palette and Photoshop, and I'll kind of move the button around. And so it's sort of just like an instinctual thing for now. And I sort of just try to stay away from being too oversaturated and not too pastel. So that's probably where like the earthy colors come in. So I try to just kind of find somewhere in between. But the short answer is I have no idea what I'm doing. And I just kind of going for it. And hopefully the fact too that like a lot of my backgrounds are white helps, because I don't have to think too much about the color, and I try to keep it like pretty clear. But I will admit that like when I'm doing a book where there's backgrounds, it's a challenge for me to try, and the color is much more of a challenge than the drawing itself.
Thank you for chatting with us.
I want to say that I really loved this book, and one of the things I particularly loved was sort of the message about like accepting mistakes and like embracing failure, and how that's part of like a natural learning process. Because I think especially now, lots of people, young and old, are very afraid of failure, because like the stakes seem really high all the time, and there's a lot of pressure. And I think that's a really good message to sort of like internalize really early.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm have a hard time with mistakes, and that's something I think comes from childhood and a lot of people struggle with. And I think it's, I've there have been a lot of times in my life, especially my early adulthood, where I sort of missed opportunities to grow because I was so afraid of making a mistake. And now that I'm older, I'm less afraid, and I sort of just make mistakes left and right, and it's fine because I know that's the only way forward. So I'm glad that you noticed that, and I hope that it helps other people, because it certainly took me 41 years to figure out that it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes.
Thank you so much. So this has been Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My library, my co-host today. I'm sorry, Jen.
That's okay. Jen, hi, goodbye.
And our guest today was
Liz Climo. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun, and I really appreciate you having me today.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.